Hi, I'm David Busch, and this is Busch History. I'm teaching American history on YouTube over the course of an entire year, going topic by topic, using a basic chronology or timeline approach. And I am following the College Board's guidelines for AP US history as I go along. You can use this information for anything in American history, but that's the crux of it. I'm using Farragher's Out of Many as a textbook guide. And in that case, we are in chapter 20 in Farragher's Out of Many. And this is topic 16. And it's the second presentation, so it's 16.2. 16.1 deals with the same information. 16.2 is a PowerPoint summarizing all of that information. This is called Commonwealth and Empire, 1870 to 1900. Now again, you can go on the Busch History website, buschhistory.net. This is topic 16, based on chapter 20 in Farragher's Out of Many. And there's a folder on the website with all the information that I present in these YouTube webinars. Let's take a look. During the latter part of the 19th century, government starts to grow. People are moving to the cities. Moving to the cities is going to require greater government services. So local governments finance police, school system, libraries, parks, and things like that. Now, if you're going to do all of those things, you're going to have rising taxes. People got to pay to support those things. The federal government is expanding. As a result of going out west, we're going to get the Department of Agriculture. The Department of Agriculture is going to come along, and we're also going to get the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is a direct result of the farmers' movement that we're going to call populism. One of the things the populists wanted was government regulation of the railroads, and they're going to get that in 1887 with the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is going to pass the Interstate Commerce Act. The Interstate Commerce Act creates the Interstate Commerce Commission. And what that's going to do is regulate rail rates, and it's also going to regulate the storage rates in grain elevators and grain storage facilities alongside the railroads. No longer can railroads give their best customers favored prices at the expense of their customers who are not shipping nearly as much grain. And that's going to really help the farmers a lot. And what it also is a shift in philosophy in the United States government. Maybe we need to help the farmers out a little bit here, because if there are no farms, then there's no food for the people in the cities. Another thing that's occurring is something called the spoils system. The spoils system is pretty much just what it sounds like. It's to the winner belongs the spoils. It goes all the way back to Andrew Jackson when he becomes president of the United States and he gives his supporters jobs. Well, that's continued now all the way from 1829 well into the latter part of the 19th century. And time after time, city commissioners' jobs are being awarded, or secretary of this is being awarded, or head of that is being awarded to people, not based on their competence, but based on their friendship. And that's going to cause a problem because people are going to start to expect it. So what happens is, in 1873, right after the assassination of President Garfield, Garfield was assassinated by a disgruntled supporter named Guiteau, who did not get a job in the Garfield administration. So he's assassinated. And shortly after, we're going to get the Pendleton Civil Service Act. The Pendleton Civil Service Act is an act that basically says if you want a job for the government, you need to take a test to show that you're competent. And based on the score you get for that test, that is how you will be hired. And that exists even till today. If you want a job for the government in the United States, you're supposed to prove your competence in a test, and then you're hired based on your score on that test. It doesn't always hold, but it holds for many jobs in the United States government nevertheless. And it's a reform. It's a beginning of a reform for the good old boy network. It doesn't hold every time, but it does provide a basis. In 1891, the Court of Appeals grants Congress, in 1881, Congress is granted the power to review cases at will. What that means is, instead of you or I bringing a case into the court system, if the Supreme Court thinks there's something a little funny, there's some shenanigans going on, they can choose. They don't often choose to do this, but they can choose to review the circumstance behind a case if they think there's something wrong with that case. Now that's a big step, because prior to that, if you wanted to review something under judicial review, if you wanted to review a ruling or review a case or have a law examined, you had to bring suit into the court system. Now it's decided that the court can take its own measures to analyze a situation when it deems necessary. It gives a lot more power to the Supreme Court. The Grange, something I mentioned in 16.1, the Grange is going to ultimately evolve into the populace. In 1867, farmers on the Great Plains formed the Patrons of Husbandry, led by this guy Oliver Kelly. Grangers, as they were called, and I jokingly use the expression growers on the range, Grangers. These Grangers, they wanted, it starts out, let's back up. It starts out as a social group of farmers who have been isolated, now they're able to get together. Gee, let's have a hoedown and let's dance. But what do they talk about? They talk about their problems, and they talk about the things they have in common. And they talk about what the railroads are charging, they talk about crop production, talk about things like that, and they unify ultimately, and they're going to become a political force known as the populists. And these populists are going to want government intervention. In 1873, Illinois passed the Warehouse Act, establishing maximum rates for storing grain. So this is a minor victory. Now, these grain storage buildings alongside the railroad tracks, because that's what would happen, is the farmers would bring their grain to the railroad tracks, waiting for the trains to come, but they'd have to store them. They'd have to store that grain. And the people who own these grain storage facilities, called grain elevators, would charge incredible fees. And they would charge them at whim, whatever they felt like charging. So in Munn versus Illinois, I'm sorry, not Munn versus Illinois, the Warehouse Act says, no, you can't do that anymore. You can't do that anymore. We're going to establish rates for storing that grain. So you can't charge some people one price per ton and other people another price for another price per ton. Sorry about that, getting confused here. Munn versus Illinois, 1887. Supreme Court upheld the law, stating that the states had the power to regulate private property in the public interest. So Munn versus Illinois upholds the Warehouse Act. So now states can actually regulate this stuff. And this is a win for the farmers. This is a win for the populace. Now finally, they're going to get some help from the government. Now you have alliances of farmers and women. Women are going to start to get involved, as women have a much more active role out west than they do in the east. State by state, women are granted the right to vote in local elections. Women are working out in the fields. Women are valued. It's not like they're showpieces back east where they're not working hard. They are working out west. They are instrumental in the settling of the West. In 1889, the National Farmers Alliance and Industrial Union had 3 million white members. So this is an organization that's going to be part of the populace. The Colored Farmers Alliance and Cooperative Union spread across the South and had another 1 million members. Mary E. Lease advised farmers to raise less corn and raise more hay. She was an instigator. She was an instigator for political action. And then we get the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They think one of the big problems in the United States, and out west, by the way, is too much consumption of alcohol. It's ruining society. And the temperance movement, which starts before the Civil War, continues after the Civil War, and it's the largest reform movement of the 19th century. And at the same time, women are going for political power. They want the right to vote. And that is finally going to happen with the 19th Amendment in 1920. It's going to take a long time yet, though. Workers are going to try and get power here, because now we know what's happened with the populace, but the overproduction of the farms and the foreclosing of farms is leading people to go to the cities. And when they go to the cities, they are working in factories. And immigrants are coming to the United States and they are working in factories. And those factories are pushing the limits of what people can actually endure. So unions are starting to form. Unions are starting to form in different workplaces, and they're going to want to reform their working conditions. They're starting to have a series of riots as these workforces, as these unions are seeking power. In 1874, the Tompkins Square riot, the first major riot. There are thousands, over 10,000 riots at one point in American history, pretty close together. The Great Uprising of 1877, the first nationwide strike. The whole nation has primarily due to the railroads, but the railroads across the nation are on strike, and the Army's got to come in to put down the strike, which is amazing because now the government is on the side of business. Henry George writes his book, Progress and Poverty, and in this book, Henry George says, isn't it interesting that the more we progress, the more poverty we have. Why is that? If we're progressing so well, we should have less poverty. But in reality, we're having more poverty. It doesn't make a lot of sense that as we progress, we're going to have more poor people as opposed to less poor people. It's an interesting point. It's a beginning of a movement towards socialism in the United States and government control. And we know that that's going to be a lot of angst for business. In 1883, the stock market crashes. There are many crashes of the stock market. There are many recessions in America. We have a cycle of boom and bust, boom and bust, boom and bust. Business works in cycles. We have a lot of investment. That investment causes a lot of production. That production leads to overproduction. That overproduction leads to a drop in prices, which leads to workers being laid off, which leads to unemployment, which leads to a lack of consumption, which leads to recession. And there we go, again and again and again and again. Anyway, in 1893, the nation's major rail lines went bankrupt. They went bankrupt because they keep lowering rates more, and they're deeply in debt to the banking system. Well, when the nation's rails go bankrupt, they have to lay off a lot of workers. During this recession, if you like, it's not that we have a lot of starvation, but we have a lot of suffering in the United States, a lot of poor people in the United States, and they want jobs, they're demanding jobs. This guy, Jacob Coxey, starts what comes to be known as Coxey's Army, and it's a populist movement, a little like the Occupy movement of recent years in cities around the United States. And they're going to march. They're going to march to Washington, D.C., demanding jobs. So Jacob Coxey starts marching from the Midwest across the United States to Washington. He wants to go see the president. He wants jobs. And it's called a Million-Man March by Jacob Coxey. Unfortunately, as he's moving along across the United States, local officials are breaking up that march and interfering with it. But his march on Washington, D.C. to demand public works program, they were dubbed and arrested. They were clubbed, and arrested. But it showed that people were willing to organize to get something done. We started to have a series of strikes. This, by the way, is Andrew Carnegie. And this is Henry Frick. Anyway, Amalgamated Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers, the most powerful union of the American Federation of Labor, they were defeated by Carnegie and Frick in 1892 at the Homestead Strike. Frick had cut wages by 10%, and the strike occurred. Well, what happened was Frick hired Pinkertons to break up the strike. The American Railway Union brought railroad workers across the nation into one organization. In May of 1894, the union supported a nationwide strike of Pullman workers at the Pullman car plant. The Pullman car plant made railway cars for the rich and famous, for the wealthy. These lavish cars, like the first Winnebagos, I like to joke about it, the first motorhomes. Anyway, these were highly skilled workers, and they're going to go on strike. This guy, William Gladden, he warned churches about ignoring social problems because the churches were ignoring social problems. He said, you got to get into this. The church has got to take a stand. He advised business to return to Christ's teachings. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. Take care of society. If you take care of the people will be able to take care of you. If Christ came to Chicago, and if Jesus came to Boston, question these social inequities. They took a look at American society and they said, hey, wait a minute. We're not living according to the Christian values that we portend to believe in. We're living for the value of money and for gold. And we care more about wealth than we care about people. So we start to have a social gospel movement beginning to form at this point. The Young Women's Christian Association is still working on temperance, but while it's working on temperance, it's also working on providing homes for the homeless. The free silver debate that I talked about in 16.1. If you have money that's based on silver, you have more money in circulation, period. There's more silver. If there's more silver, you can circulate more money. What happens is the value of money drops. It's like children with pennies. They don't know that it's worth less. But if you base money on gold, the value of money rises, but there's a limited amount of gold, and you can only have so much of it, so you have less money in circulation. So that debate is going to occur in the 1880s and 1890s. The Coinage Act in 1873 replaced silver with gold for minting purposes, called the crime of 73. Silver was still in circulation, but now we're going to go back to gold. And we're going to restrict the amount of money in circulation because we're using more precious metal, less money in circulation. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, now we're going to flip back the other way. Now we're going to start using silver again. It said basically, we return to free exchange of silver, and the Sherman Silver Purchase Act says the government will purchase all the silver that can be mined pretty much, and it will take that silver and make it into coins. Well, that's going to encourage this vast mining of silver, which is going to encourage this tremendous inflation as the value of silver drops. And that's going to lead to a panic in 1893. We're going to get the McKinley Tariff of 1890, and that's going to try to protect American businesses, but tariffs are always bad for farmers because farmers need to buy the cheapest goods available to produce their food. And remember, if the farmers go out of business, we all starve. So the farmers are in trouble here. President Grover Cleveland, he wants the Sherman Act repealed because he thinks the economy is going to hell. And he's right. We can't produce an unlimited amount of coins based on silver because they'll have no value. Nor can we produce a strictly limited amount based on gold because it'll have too much value and not enough people will have it. We haven't figured out economics in the United States yet, so we're still going through this cycle of up and down and up and down. The election of 1896 becomes a battle for this kind of situation. It becomes a battle between William Jennings Bryan and William McKinley. William McKinley is the big business candidate. William McKinley wants a gold standard, and he doesn't want all of these reforms. William Jennings Bryan, a very religious man, believes in the social gospel, believes in religious involvement in society. He wants free silver. Well, in 1896, with a lot of help from big business, gold wins and silver loses. The Republican William McKinley had 10 times the amount of money to spend on his campaign over Bryan. Bryan was popular, he was a populist, he was the populist candidate, he was the Democratic candidate. The populists had yielded a candidate for the United States presidency, and he was William Jennings Bryan. But what happens is, Bryan loses and McKinley wins. The populists dwindle away. At the same time, we haven't forgotten about racialists in the United States. We have this whole idea of nativism is in the United States. Again, it's really racism. Nativism, America for the Americans. Immigrants are bad. You have to be born in the United States. Immigrants are taking jobs away. The new immigration is occurring. It's post-1890. The new immigrants don't speak English, which fuels the racism against them. And you also have Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws restricting what blacks can do in American society. In 1896, we have Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson says that you have separate facilities, and they're equal facilities for blacks and whites. The whole thing about Homer Plessy and the train car in Louisiana, where he could not sit in the whites-only train car all the way with white. So the Supreme Court says, no, separate but equal is fine, as long as it's equal. Grandfather clause and literacy test were the name of the game. You can only vote if your grandfather voted. Well, if your grandfather didn't vote, gee, we're sorry, Big Jim, you can't vote because your grandfather didn't vote. Jim goes, well, what am I supposed to do? Well, I'm sorry, Jim, you'll have to think about that, but that's what the law says. Or, Big Jim, you have to read this, because every person that votes can read. Big Jim goes, wait a minute, I can't read. Well, I'm sorry, Big Jim, you can't vote. So those things were being done to limit the access of black voters into the voting system and limit suffrage for black voters. Foreigners were used as scapegoats for every problem in society. They're taking our jobs, they're destroying our cities. Ida B. Wells writes The Red Record. The Red Record is about lynchings that pervade the South. And she goes around and she studies the lynchings in the South and writes about them in her book, The Red Record. And we really see we are a divided nation. Reconstruction has largely failed for the blacks in the South. Jim Crow laws in Plessy versus Ferguson prove that. Imperialism. At the same time we're being racist in the United States, we're going to be racist overseas. White makes right. We get this guy, Frederick Jackson Turner, a noted, respected historian of the day. He turns around and writes, the Americans are who they are based on this theory of the never-ending frontier. We keep expanding and expanding and conquering, and that's who we are. And that once the frontier is closed, we're going to look overseas. And indeed, how are we going to do it? We're going to do it because we are going to build a navy. And Josiah Strong comes up with this idea of economic expansion based on spiritualism and Christianity. We should spread Christianity around the world. A guy by the name of Alfred Mahan comes up with the idea of building an American Navy, a great white fleet. And indeed, we build ships using Carnegie steel, made out of steel. And those ships are going to be painted white with gold gilding around them. And we're going to send these things around the world to show how big and powerful we are. At the same time, we're going to take Hawaii. The Boxer Rebellion is a war in China. Chinese against foreign incursion. We're going to have the war in Cuba called the Spanish-American War. We're going to have the war in the Philippines in which 250,000 Filipinos are killed as we try to occupy it. All because we're the United States and we can. Also, each one of these new areas becomes a market for new American materials, and they become a source of raw materials to fuel the American industrial machine. Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War. Let's free Cuba from Spanish domination. Well, if that's the case, why do we attack the Philippines first? They call it a splendid little war. April to August 1898. At the end of that war, we get the Philippines, we get Guam, we get Puerto Rico, we get control of Cuba. We get the entire Spanish Empire. It becomes the American Empire. We do it under the guise of we're freeing people. But we dominate the Philippines. We dominate the Philippines till World War II. Then the Japanese dominated. Then we free it, we dominate it again, and we still control the Philippines to a great extent. Puerto Rico had nothing to do with anything, and we take it. Guam had nothing to do with anything, and we take it. These become markets. As we say we're freeing people from domination, we're actually dominating them. So if you take a look at the United States towards the end of the 19th century, you see, I can't do that. Pause. 3, 2, 1. So if you take 3, 2, 1. So if you take a look at the United States at the end of the 19th century, we are the child becoming the adult. We are the young man with all kinds of strength and all kinds of vision and not a lot of wisdom. Because look what we do. We're going to subjugate part of our population. The farmers, the immigrants, and the blacks. We're going to do that. We're going to try and spread our power around the world. American Imperialism. We're doing that because we need new markets for the tremendous wealth that we're building and our manufacturing capacity. And what's that going to cause us to do? We're going to get into wars around the world. The young guy getting into fights because to prove he's better than everybody else. And that's going to be the dawn of the 20th century in the United States. We're going to enter the 20th century as the economic powerhouse for the world. At the same time, we're going to be struggling with our social issues internally. The union movement is catching steam. The temperance movement is catching steam. The suffrage movement is catching steam. And it's all going to come to a head in 1901 when William McKinley is assassinated and Teddy Roosevelt, the rock star in the United States, is going to become president of the United States. But that's going to be topic 17, which will be the next topic I'm going to cover in Bush history. So for now, this is David Busch for Busch History. Remember, everything here is available on the Busch History website, www.buschhistory.net. And have a good day. Until next time, take care.